Welcome to Real Life Renos, the podcast. Today we have with us again Ron Wickman, an architect who specializes in accessibility in residential, commercial, and public spaces. Today we're going to dive a little deeper, and while today's subject matter may sound like it's geared toward builders, municipal and county planners, and municipal councilors, and it is, Ron and I both agree that the more homeowners know about the mechanics of achieving accessibility, the better off they'll all be in terms of understanding the questions to ask when they're considering a new build and being able to assess their own ability to make modifications to existing homes. Welcome, Ron.
Hi, thanks for having me.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So in our last podcast, we touched on a term, visitability. And you did explain what it was, but for those who maybe haven't heard our first podcast, could you explain that again?
Yeah, visitability is an accessibility term. It's kind of what we call the low-hanging fruit or the easiest type of accessibility to achieve, and it essentially is designed to allow people with mobility difficulties to at least enter your home and visit and stay for a little bit. So that means the entrance has to be accessible by wheelchair. No steps at the door. Typically, we'd like to see that door being the main entry door, but in some cases it could be a side door or back door. Secondly, the doorway to get through and any kind of hallway space is needed to be wide enough for somebody in a wheelchair to maneuver around. So, in today's context, almost all residential homes have 3 foot wide doors at the main entrance. So that's not a problem. And hallways typically are wide enough as well. So again, not too much of a problem there. And then the third concept with visitability would be to make sure that a bathroom is accessible for somebody, again, who might be using a wheelchair or other mobility device to be able to uh, get in, shut the door, and use the bathroom. And then they can stay for a bit. Beyond that, the rest of the house may not be accessible. Two-story house or even gaining access to the basement would be something that would be more difficult for somebody, again, with a mobility limitation.
Terrific. As we've discussed before, there is an issue with language and people calling the same thing different terms and a plethora of terms that describe sort of, kind of, but not quite the same thing. So people may encounter terms like visitable design, enhanced visibility, adaptable housing, accessible housing, and universal design. There's inclusive design and flex housing. Some terms are more American and some are European. Where do we stand on all of this, and how should people relate to those terms?
Yeah,
It's a
it
lot.
is it is it is tough. Yeah, and I mean I grew up with my father being in a wheelchair, so even the language we use to speak about people with disabilities has changed in time. So I don't even want to say some of the terms that were used when I was very young. But a term like handicapped is something we don't like to use as much. And bottom line there, to just cut to the chase on this, when you're referring to somebody with a disability, just always put the individual or the person before the disability. So it's okay to say somebody is blind. You just say, I have a friend who is blind, or I have a friend who is in a wheelchair, or my mom has a mobility issue. So again, always the person first. And that's something I use as a trigger to verify whether the person I'm speaking to kind of has done some of their own research and maybe has talked about the issues more. So taking that to the various terms we use for accessibility here in Canada, we would often refer to it in the building industry as barrier-free design. And the reason for that is that's how the code talks about the issue of accessibility. So it's the barrier-free design guide, barrier-free issues, and that's simply removing barriers to accessibility. But again, that tends to focus on the disability itself. And so in 1986, a gentleman, Ron Mace, who was an architect and used a wheelchair, came up with the term universal design. And ever since then, in the United States, universal design is a term that's more often used than anything else. And that really is trying to spin the concept of accessibility to include as many people as possible. So uh, when they talk about designing products or building spaces, exterior, interior spaces, it's designed to accommodate small children and older adults and everybody in between. That same concept uh, is used in Europe, where they talk mostly about inclusive design, and that's inclusive and universal are sort of interchangeable. For myself, I've I've just concluded that when I talk to people here in Canada, I use the term accessibility because that's always what I end up coming back to anyway. So if I say I specialize in universal design or inclusive design, most people will say, well, what is that? And then I say, well, I specialize in designing for people with disabilities. And they go, oh, accessible. Yeah, accessible or barrier free. So
Right.
we kind of go back and forth. And some if I forget to mention it, I don't think I will. But I think the onus again is on all of us to educate ourselves, and that's something you and I will be talking about throughout this podcast. Is the more we know and the more we're educated about these issues of accessibility, the better we can talk to our politicians, our friends, colleagues, builders, developers. So it's on us to improve our own education on all of this. And there's lots of information out there that you can find, um, but there are very few experts. I must say that at this stage.
Right. I think there was a really good lesson in the first part of what you said there, talking about putting the person first. So you don't have a blind friend, you have a friend who is blind. The
Yeah,
words matter. They matter a great deal. And
yeah.
educating ourselves is really what these podcasts are all about. We're going to help to try to educate people.
Yeah, and like a lot of times, I might be talking to somebody in the building industry, and they'll say, "Oh, I've done lots of buildings for those wheelchair people." And to me, that's just a trigger that probably you haven't, because you're not even saying it right. so,
Absolutely.
so then I go, okay, well, I'm gonna check you out a little bit more, right? So I use that as my cue to help me assess the situation that I'm in, because I mean, I think everybody likes to think that they know a lot about the issues and the topic, but it's a difficult one, and it's I'm 57 now. I've been around it my whole life, and every day I learn something new, and how to approach the problem a little bit more strategically.
Right. Now, talk about adaptive housing, what that is, and that speaks to the no step entrance.
Yeah, yeah. So the no step entrance would be part of what we call adaptable housing. So adaptable housing is really one step up from visitable housing. So the features I mentioned with visitable housing, that being the no step entrance, the wider door and hallways. I shouldn't even say wider, but a wide enough door. So we're not asking for anything special. It's just a 3 foot wide door. So inside the house, it would be great to have all your doors be 3 feet wide, and that's certainly a trend that I've noticed is happening. So even in an extra bedroom, spare bedroom, or sometimes even in a washroom, the family washroom, the 3 foot wide door is being used more often. And the washroom is what we find to be the trickiest space to make adaptable. But adaptable housing really means having a house that has purposely been designed in the first place to allow for easy adaptations in the future. So, if you had a house that was adaptable, it's not likely you would ever have to do any structural modifications to the house, or anything really that would be moving walls or adding space here or there. Everything's been done already so that the infrastructure is there. So the space is there. And then in terms of details in a bathroom, for example, there would be a plywood. I always put plywood floor to ceiling in a bathroom on all the walls. And then we finish it with drywall and then some waterproofing, maybe around a shower area, that kind of thing. And so as you grow older, or as your needs maybe change, you can add a grab bar anywhere you want. It's not specific to any kind of code issue or requirement.
So the plywood that you're talking about is something that people who have watched any of our programs or listened to other podcasts may have heard referred to as backing.
Backing, correct. Yes, yeah.
Right. And
Yeah. And so the
yes.
trend was always, the backing was just put where uh, your books on standards or your regulations would say, oh yeah, put some backing at 3 feet above the floor. Well, not everybody in a wheelchair or with a mobility limitation needs it at that height. And so if we just abide by what the regulations or standards tell us, we're going to miss out on so many people. So again, the backing becomes the entire wall surface.
Right. And, case in point, a colleague of mine and yours as well, Julie Sawchuk, tells a story about building her bathroom and having the backing put in, not all the way to the floor. And then she got a seat for the shower without realizing that the bottom strut anchored 6 inches above the floor. So the tile work had already been done and so on. So they had to go in from the hallway, remove the drywall, install the backing, and then re-drywall. So if you don't know what the future holds for you, and who among us really does, back the whole thing, right?
And just to tell the story of that, because it is relevant to our discussion about the no step entrance, is I started my practice in the early 90s. And when I talked about adding backing in a bathroom for the future use of grab bars, there was a lot of pushback, a lot of resistance from the industry saying, oh, well, you know how much more expensive that's going to be? And so they would try to find scraps of lumber that were already at site and use them for filling in. So it took a great number of years for me to convince the industry, and not just myself, but others, convince the industry that, if you just do the backing all at once, it's not going to be that much more. And so today, fast forward to 2022, uh, it's not a question I get asked anymore. So if I say put the backing on all the walls of the bathroom, the builders just go, yeah, okay, no problem. I mean, they might
Right.
be. There's this kind of pandemic thing that has happened the last couple of years, and now a war that is causing a great deal of stress on our industry. But that's not. I mean, that's something else. That's something we can't control. But
Right.
generally, the industry is becoming more adaptable themselves and more accepting of these features because they see the wisdom in it, and that's a great thing. That's a changing of the attitude, which is so important in all of this.
Right. And if you just do it while you're building it, as you say, then you don't have to tear it apart later and do a
Yeah,
renovation. You just get to put
yeah.
in the modifications that are needed. It's
and
really
and
helpful.
again, again, sorry, back
That's okay.
to the buying public. They have to know these things, right? They have to know to ask
Yes.
the builder, because if they say, oh, I want to make sure that I have the ability to add grab bars in the future. Well, that builder might not be as informed and go, okay, well, I'll put some backing at 3 feet above the ground, but nowhere else. And so if the home buyer says, oh, I heard a podcast, or I read an article, or I talked to somebody that does this for a living, and we should just put plywood on all the walls, then it just gets done, right? So
Right.
again, it's back to ourselves educating ourselves on all of this,
And knowing what to ask for. And
and
and the
knowing
more
what to
the
ask
more
for.
people ask, the more builders will think that that's a normal conversation to have, and then it doesn't become a conversation at all. They just do it.
Exactly the point. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Let,
perfect.
let's dig into the no step entrance a bit, because when you and I were preparing for this program, I was fascinated by what I learned from what you told me. And so if you are a builder or a counselor or a planner, this section is really for you. And if you're a homeowner, you need to know this stuff so that you know what you're buying or what you have the ability to modify.
Yes, yeah. So, just to take you on a short journey of my time in all of this is, again, I approach this as a designer, architect, as an advocate for people with disabilities. So, when I first read about visitability, um, and I have to say that I lived in a visitable house without knowing it in the late 60s and 70s and beyond. So it wasn't until again in the late 80s that visitability even became a term. But we lived it because my dad had to have a house that was accessible for him to get in and out of. Um, but the no step entrance concept was just again something that the builders just didn't really understand or appreciate. So they're just used to building a certain way, and um, they even in my parents' house that they built, it was still built 2 feet off the ground, and it was only at the 11th hour that my dad pointed out that he couldn't get in, and they sort of poured this really steep concrete ramp to the back door for him to get in and out of, and he used that for much of his life. And again, in those days the attitude was, well, you just have to live with it, right? This is just the way it is. And so it took a long time to start to for me to start to appreciate that we do actually have the power to make change, right? And so I started hearing about this idea of visitability, and I thought, well, this is a great idea. And then when I started hearing the costs involved, I went, well, this is really a no-brainer. This is so easy. Maybe $300 extra to add a or to make sure that you have a no-step entrance at your house. And so I was pretty hard, I have to admit, on the building industry, thinking, you guys, like, this is so easy, like, just do it, right? And it was only as I started to get involved myself and starting to work with builders and work on house renovations and new homes that I started to realize, oh, this is actually a little bit more complicated than I thought. And so in this part of the world, in Canada, where we build with basements and we build mostly with wood, we have to protect the wood from water. And so that's the reason why we typically build at least 2 feet off the ground, so that we can keep our floor joists away from the ground. And so all of a sudden you have to start thinking a little bit differently. So two things happen. One is you're changing the way builders build, and secondly, there's the cost involved simply because there's more time involved to start learning how to actually do this. And uh, since then, the building industry has started to pay more attention to this idea, and there are different innovative ways that we can talk a little bit more about. Innovative ways to do your foundation work and keep the wood away from the water. Uh, and then just to get us to today, what I've come to realize is that all of this starts from the very beginning when we first have a bare piece of land, a big piece of land where we might be eventually housing 30,000 people in various types of housing, multifamily, single family housing. And the way we lay out the land in terms of water management and our infrastructure, the sewer lines, water lines, all that is crucial to us actually going all the way back to achieving this no step entrance.
So take us to the sewage treatment plant and let's work back from there to the
Yeah.
house because
Yeah.
that's really fascinating.
So yeah, I just wanted to pause there so I had a chance to breathe too.
It's a
So
lot.
so yeah, so this is what's happened is I started my own work 20 years ago, realizing that, yeah, this is really tricky stuff, right? And so I said, well, what's the problem? We'll just build the house so that it's lower to the ground, and then we can have a nice gentle sidewalk to the entranceway. And then as I started to get into it, I realized, well, because we have basements, we want our basement floor to actually be lower, um, or sorry, higher than the sewer invert. So the existing, or the infrastructure that's been put into the ground, the sewer, and then they call it an invert. So that's where, when we flush our toilets, everything that's flushed down the toilet goes to this invert in the subdivision or the neighborhood community that we're in, and that gets pumped up to what they call a lift station. Um, and those lift stations, over many miles, let's say, or kilometers, keep going down, and then they get lifted up and down, and then eventually they end up at a water treatment plant. So here in Edmonton, frankly, I'm not sure how many water treatment plants we have, but there aren't many. So in a sprawling city like Edmonton, there's lots of neighborhoods, and there's lots of lift stations, and so yeah, everything has to get ultimately to the water treatment plant. And so again, you work your way from what the elevation of the water treatment plant is, and then of course everything has to go downhill. So you're just going through the series of downhill slopes to lift stations pumping them up, and then downhill slopes, and so on. So when we actually get a piece of property that we can build a house on, we're 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 dictated, the elevation of our basement floor is dictated by whatever the existing sewer invert is. And so what I've been finding is that they're only as low as they have to be, to make all of this work. So they could be lower, but the developers would argue that if we make it lower, we're digging further into the ground, and we're increasing the costs of the development. So by the time I start working with a client and we start designing a house, and we want this no step entrance, we have to think about the the basement floor ultimately, and try to keep it above the sewer invert. And what I've been finding is that, uh, in many cases now, we're realizing that, to have a basement, even an 8 foot high floor to ceiling space, our basement floor is going to be lower. So what that means is then we have to have a sump or lift station within our home, so that when we flush the toilets in our home, it goes to the lift station, or the lift station, or sump in our home, that gets pumped up to the sewer invert in our community, and then again it eventually makes its way to the water treatment plant. And that poses two problems. The lift station in our house, one is, maybe not a big deal, but it is an increased cost of maybe $3,000 to $5,000, to the overall budget of our home. The second thing that is potentially more problematic is if our lift station in our house actually fails, because then we have a real mess in our basement. So they're not designed to fail, obviously, but they are something mechanical, and most people would rather not have that if they didn't have to. So this is all something that I've been learning in the last 20 some years. And so it's a matter now of trying to figure out a way to design our neighborhoods so that the infrastructure is actually lower, and the land is sculpted in a way that allows us to have these no step entrances, at least in some parts of the neighborhood.
Right. So the sculpting piece becomes important because you could have some higher elevations in one corner and have the ability to go down further, but the house looks the same.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And that's something too, that I just, kind of an overarching comment I'd like to make about this is with this issue of accessibility. I often find that when I speak about accessibility, uh, if people feel they can't achieve 100% accessibility, then they completely shut down and then they do nothing. So I've really been, especially in the last 10 years, I've been saying to people, something is better than nothing. So if you can't make 100% of your homes or your lots, your properties, so that they could have a no step entrance, at least make some of them that way, right?
Right.
So again, it just gets back to when the developer buys that piece of land, that big piece of land, and they're going to create a subdivision with roads and maybe a school area, parkland, and single family house lots and multifamily house lots. If they're not thinking about this concept of accessibility and the no step entrance, then nothing's going to happen. So they have to say, let's make this part of our conversation. So when we're designing this and laying out this neighborhood, let's think about this and take advantage of perhaps areas of the property that do lend itself quite easily to visitable housing. So um, that's just, it's got to be part of the conversation right from the very beginning.
And so that goes back to the planners at the municipal and county levels, and then to the members of council who have to approve this stuff. The council members have to be aware of who their constituents are. And for so many small towns, they've got aging populations. And there is nothing that will make people leave their homes faster than an inability to get in and out of their house, coupled with an inability to use a washroom and keep themselves clean. They will have to leave the house. So if you're thinking about your community and who lives there, and we've already talked about the fact that no step entrances benefit everybody. I mean, I have a daughter with a baby and strollers, and just getting in and out of places is another level of difficulty with all of that now. So it's not just the aging population, but I think if people do think about the aging population and build it for them, it's better for everybody, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I'm just thinking about your comment about the baby carriage too. In my neighborhood, well, I have three grandkids now, so I'm seeing some pretty big baby carriages come to my house, and my house is visitable, as we'll see a little later. Uh, but one thing that I can say and actually take pride in is at Halloween, my house is the only one in the neighborhood that people children with disabilities in wheelchairs, let's say, can actually come right to my door and I can hand out candy to them. Otherwise, they're getting mom or dad to come and collect the candy
Right.
for them. And they're just always on the public sidewalk and never getting to, I don't get to see the kids and greet
Right.
them and all that. Right. So we all miss out on that. So,
There was somebody that ran a Halloween program in neighborhoods here in Ontario last year. I wish I could remember the name of the company, but they ran a special program that had people taking their Halloween offerings to the sidewalk. And they had signage and there was all kinds
yeah.
of stuff people could have. So I don't know if that's a new thing or not. I just saw it for the first time this year.
Yeah, it is fairly new, but it is, again, it's something that um, uh, is happening, which is great. But again, all my life, I've seen people with disabilities having to adapt to the conditions that exist, not the other way around, right? So
Right.
for for, for a long time, and my dad was, not only was my dad somebody who used a wheelchair, but he was also a strong advocate himself, an activist and a politician. So I was around that kind of atmosphere, and it was always watching him having to accept what was there, and that just wasn't good enough for him, right? So that's
Right.
certainly in my DNA as well, and so um, it's great that we do adapt to the conditions that we live in, but wouldn't it be so much better if we just made it so much easier?
For everyone.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Now, you had a couple of case studies that we're going to talk about, one with architectural control. So let's talk about that one first.
Yeah, that I did want to mention because that's also, I don't know what to call it, kind of a systemic condition, I guess. But architectural controls are a North American thing. I've never heard of them being in Europe or Asia or anywhere else in the world. But they're mainly focused on newer subdivisions, so suburban environments. And the architectural controls are designed, I guess, in concept to have everybody in the neighborhood kind of behave themselves, for lack of a better way to put it, and build houses that are um, sort of the same, to improve the overall property value for everybody. So um, we can't just have a free for all. So there are planning controls to ensure that people are using the proper exterior materials, the having the right pitches of roof, things that when you I guess, walk through or drive through the neighborhood, you're seeing kind of a consistency that uh, somebody's determined that helps keep property values high. And so, in all of that, what I found as a consistent architectural control out there is that homes have to have a minimum of at least three steps to the front door. So somehow it's been deemed that steps to the front door are appealing and people want them, and they improve the resale value of the home and improve the sale of the home. So it's just, we've been conditioned to think that this is a great thing and everybody should have it. So when I do have clients that want to build a house without steps at the front door, uh, we spend a lot of energy and time trying to navigate through the system, which doesn't normally allow for it. So we have to get special approvals from the developer, and then we have to work our way through, as I mentioned, the issues around the sewer inverts and the way the land has already been designed to have the proper water management. So we're actually trying to change our specific lot to allow for this no step entrance, but it's going counter to everything that's been designed before. So it's really it really becomes a tricky problem. And again, everything hinges on ultimately the the people who own the architectural controls to say whether we can even do it or not. So a lot of times in architecturally controlled neighborhoods, people uh, give in to the idea that they need the steps at the front door, and then they provide or they have an elevator within the house that you would enter from your garage, your attached garage at the front. So that's really counter to the concept of visitability, though, because to me, that's not a visitable home. That's a home that's usable and functional for the resident of the home. But for somebody, a friend or family member who has to go through the big garage door, to enter an elevator to get to the main floor level, that's really not, to me, that's not a visitable home.
That's a dignity issue. I mean, everybody should be
Yeah.
able to go through the front door, right?
Yeah.
Everybody, regardless. Right.
Yes. Yeah.
So, who awards architectural controls? Is this something that the builder does? Does the municipality have the right to award it or overrule it? Or who decides who has control?
It's basically it's just like an industry standard. So it's done by the developers themselves. So
Okay.
the government has no real say. They have a say in terms of the infrastructure, the sewer lines and water lines and all that. They have a say in the water management. So there's certain codes in terms of grading of the land and all that. There's codes related to the creation of roadways and sidewalks. So roadways have to be, wide enough to accommodate emergency vehicles. Sidewalks have to be designed to, again, control and do the water management, all that sort of stuff. But the architecture controls is purely a marketing thing. It's just up to the industry to determine that. So it's always changing, the architecture controls, trying to adapt to, I guess, what the I never know if the market's demanding it or the developers are sort of creating the demand. So that's always a bit of a loaded issue, I guess.
My guess would be the latter because they
That's my
like to
guess.
build cookie cutter. They've got the pro forma. They just go ahead and do it. One, two, three, four,
Yeah.
five. It's easier that way.
It's safer, and then it's easier to then control the costs and the rewards, right? The the
Right.
ability to make money if everything's controlled and safer.
So overcoming that, countering it, is the job of the planners, the counselors, who have to ultimately approve it.
I yeah, like I think government should definitely get more involved. I know that's here in Alberta, that's not a not the greatest thing to say. So that's not a popular concept here, especially as opposed to other parts of Canada. But generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that the 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 developers, builders, the people who make our housing would rather not have too much government say on things. They like the idea that the market can kind of dictate what actually gets built. Um, but there, it's anything to do with this is, I'm not talking about social housing when I talk about accessible housing, but anything to do with social housing, affordable housing. Typically, governments do have to step in and create some kind of situation where we can build this kind of stuff. So I know in the last federal election and moving forward, governments are, especially here in North America, are talking more and more about the need for affordable housing. So we're really seeing, if nothing else, this pandemic's also shown that we haven't been doing a great job of taking care of our more vulnerable citizens, our aging population, our elders, and people with disabilities, and we have a real problem with affordable housing. So I think it's up to the government to somehow get involved, and that's maybe not becoming developers themselves, but certainly something with incentives, perhaps, and maybe some more rules and regulations. They certainly are doing that when it comes to sustainable design and construction. So the government's quite involved in making sure that builders are paying attention to energy efficiency in their homes, and there are incentives and rules and regulations related to that. So I don't see why that can't happen with accessibility as well.
I agree with you. And, it's not just one slice of the pie. When politicians and the bureaucrats who work for them are looking at these sorts of issues, it's not just the housing sector piece of the pie. It speaks to the healthcare piece of the pie as well. I don't know too much about the home care situation in Alberta, but in Ontario, which is where I'm based, it's it's not great. There aren't enough people. There aren't enough long-term care beds, but most people don't want to go into long-term care. There aren't enough people to take care of home care. So if their homes could be the types of environments that could support them better as they aged, that would have an impact on the health budget. So,
Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it's like the one hand scratches the back of the other hand. It all fits together. So if they pull back and look at the bigger picture, they have to see this, you would think.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it too. Like, to just pull back. That's something I've been really thinking about too. Is how do we get people to actually do that, right? And go, okay, let's really revisit this whole issue, right? And unfortunately, your vast majority of people in politics, uh, to kind of keep their job, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it,
Yeah.
they have to be a bit short-sighted, right? They want the voting public too can be pretty finicky and have short memories. So you're only as good as your last mistake or the last good thing you did. So
Right.
for those politicians, and I feel like my dad was one of those that was always thinking about the future, and he somehow managed to navigate, as a city councilor, navigate through that and be a popular figure here in the city. But whenever he was getting in trouble uh, 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 with the public, it was always with issues that he was thinking, 20 years down the road, right? He was thinking this will really be a good thing 20 years down the road, but maybe right now just got to bite the bullet and pay for it. So um, it's not a big issue today. So he was right. But curb cuts, he got a lot of political flack for insisting that we start doing curb cuts everywhere in Edmonton. And people said, "Oh, why? Like, why are we spending all this money just for a few people who use wheelchairs?" Now, today, nobody would say that, right? So many people benefit.
Right.
Again, people with baby carriages and all the rest. So, at the time, he could have gotten voted out of office because of what he was saying. But today, people, they realize that this is just a good thing for everybody. So, he always stuck to his guns, and I really appreciate that he did that. But um, even today, I just think I don't know, maybe the voting public is a bit more finicky, and they're pretty hard on politicians as soon as you make a decision they don't like, and we're seeing that clearly.
Right.
So it is really hard to be somebody that's forward thinking. And when you talk about, I'm hoping that the listeners are appreciating that, what I'm saying about the way we develop our landscape out there. This is not an easy fix, right? It's not something that just can happen overnight. We're in this one for the long haul, and it's going to be a long time. So any politician that starts to push for this is not going to, get a lot of, especially from the industry, the building industry itself. They're not going to get a lot of acceptance, right? They're going to get a lot of pushback.
Right.
So it's a tricky thing, but I'm hoping that clearer heads will prevail, and we'll start to see that. Well, and I think the issue around our elders and how we house them. If people don't understand that it's a real big problem, then yeah, I don't know what needs to happen. But certainly, I've never been busier in my time as an architect, pushing for this than now. So builders, people are saying, how do I do this so that I can stay at home?
Right.
And I'm like, well, make sure you have a no step entrance. Like that's
For
that's
starters.
that's the first thing. Yeah.
Right. And so that's actually a good segue because you talk about making changes for the long term in an environment where neighborhoods are being built. But the other side of the coin is that we have quite a stock of houses that have already been built. What do
That's
we do?
right.
What do
Yeah.
we do for
Yeah.
those people?
Yeah. And in some respects, the infill housing is even harder to achieve the no step entrance than the newer subdivisions. I guess the newer subdivisions without architectural controls that demand stairs would be fine in a way. But again, historically, the way we've built in Canada is we would have started in the early days, like the 30s, 40s, 50s. Our basements wouldn't really be basements; they'd be kind of more like crawl spaces. So if you go to a really old house, like 100-year-old house or 80-year-old house, it might just be your foundation and like a dirt floor, just like a space that might have some mechanical equipment in it, maybe like some storage of Christmas ornaments or whatever, but it just wasn't really a used space per se. It was enough to dig down into the ground to get below the frost level and have a foundation for your house that doesn't allow your house to move around. Um, but somewhere in the 50s, 60s, uh, some clever people figured out that if we just dig a little bit deeper, we could double the space of our house. So 1,000 square foot house could become 2,000 square feet with this basement space. So the basement became extremely popular. And again, always the way that we would have done our infrastructure would have been designed to get our sewer inverts just lower, just low enough to be a little bit lower than our basement foundation. So if you're thinking I only got to be 4 feet below the ground, then that's your infrastructure, right?
That's a really interesting point, because what you've just said is that at some point in the past, they justified the need to dig down a little deeper. And
Yeah,
now we're
yeah,
wanting them to dig down just a little deeper again. It's the
yeah.
same thing.
It is, yeah, yeah. But um, you could make an argument that 100% of the people saw the benefits of the basement, right? The basement space, like it's like bonus space.
True.
Um, and I would like to argue that 100% of people would benefit from the no step entrance, but that's not the way it is right now, right? That's a tougher sell. So
Right.
again, we're back to this sort of attitude. Well, why are we doing something that costs everybody more money when it's only benefiting a few? So that's a big part of our conversation too, is just changing the cultural attitudes towards all of this, right?
And
But
showing that
yeah,
it benefits more.
you're absolutely right. It's the other, just a little bit of an aside, but I think it's important, is the engineered floor joist. When I started my work as an architect in the early '90s, everything was like what they call dimensional lumber, which was just a 2x10 or 2x8, so it's solid wood. And somebody came up with this pre-engineered floor joist, which could span a greater distance and still be structurally sound. And the way they promoted it initially was no more squeaky floors. So in the '90s, the engineered floor joist was all about having no more squeaky floors. And then the plumbers and electricians and mechanical contractors went, "Wow, these engineered floor joists, I can actually run my wires in the floor joist space, and I'm eliminating bulkheads in the basement, and I can span greater distances, so I'm eliminating structural walls or teleposts in the basement." And that's when the buying public went, "Wow, this I want this too," right? And so within I started working as graduated in 1991, so I started working in architecture in the early '90s, and like literally within 5 years, it just changed completely. And so the floor joist was about 3 times the cost of dimensional lumber, and within 5 years, it was less than dimensional lumber. And so uh, I have seen and witnessed some change in the industry, like seemingly overnight, because everybody saw the benefit of it. And so again, I don't have that magic sort of bullet for the no step entrance, because I think it's the same thing. I think everybody should see the benefit of it, but it hasn't happened yet, right? So that's
Right.
that's why we still continue to promote it and talk about it. And it's not just natural, right? Like you should almost have to ask for steps instead of the other way around.
Right. Somebody who has an existing home now, couple who've raised their family and they've gone, but they want to keep the family home, how can they have a no step entrance, or can they?
Yeah. So back to that. Yeah. So again, the history of our infill development is again, it all goes back to, we're a little bit constricted because of the existing infrastructure. So um, really, for anybody that kind of spends a bit of time looking and driving and walking through neighborhoods, you're probably noticing more and more big wooden ramps, typically leading to doors, or there's sometimes you'll see a mechanical porch lift beside the front steps of a house. So people are doing that because they're having to make up quite a distance from the ground to the main floor. Sometimes probably as low as 2 feet, and then as maybe as high as 4 feet or 5 feet. And so when we think about a ramp being a 1 in 12 slope by code, so that means for every foot we go up, we have to go out 12 feet. If you're 4 feet above the ground, then you're at least 48 feet of length of ramp. And most people don't have that in their front yard. And so the other thing about infill is typically the distance from the front door to the public sidewalk is sometimes no more than 20 feet. So it is difficult to just repour a sidewalk, for example, and just have it lead to the door. The sidewalk would be just way too steep. So people end up putting ramps in, and most of the ramps that I see, and I think people would agree with me, they don't look very good. They're not, they're hard to make look um, sort of seamless and invisible, or like they weren't part of the house right from the very beginning. So again, that's where I think people often see what they think an accessible house is. This house with this big kind of ugly ramp in front of it. So that's the real challenge. So to overcome those challenges, you have to, if you wanted to renovate a house and potentially get, again, now I'm talking about like a new build, right? Tearing your house down and starting over. Then you might have to actually lower the existing sewer lines, which starts to become way more than a $5,000 extra. It's like $20,000 or $30,000 more. So it just becomes really cost prohibitive. So I would say, by and large, renovating a house to have the no step entrance, you have to have pretty ideal conditions to make it work. And I would say a large part of the housing stock just doesn't lend itself that easily because it wasn't thought about initially.
I've seen some ramps that are actually very attractive if people have the ability to take a beat and figure it out. The ramps go horizontally with the house, and in two sections, and then they're hidden by gardens.
Hmm.
So it's
Yeah,
not
I've done. Yeah.
this giant structure that splays out into the front yard or any place else for that matter. It can be very nicely done if you have the time. For a lot of people, though, they don't have the time because being able to get in and out of their house means the difference between being able to come home from rehab now or having to wait.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
that's right.
Now,
Yeah.
now you were able to achieve this in your home.
Yeah, yeah, and just to add to your comment, I've done situations where we've bypassed the front entrance as being accessible, and then we just have a sidewalk that leads to the side door, or even to the back. So then you have way more distance to play with, and then you can have basically like a sloping sidewalk that just takes you to the back door. And that's often aesthetically that's a good option. But then again, in Canada and Edmonton, where we get less snow, you just have more sidewalk to maintain and shovel and all that kind of stuff too. So it's never a perfect scenario, but there I guess, again, back to this, if you really give it some thought, you can come up with some pretty clever solutions. So it's not, don't just reserve yourself to thinking, oh well, I can't make the front door accessible, so then I'm done, I can't do anything, right? Really think this through and know that there's other options that are available, and that's where a good designer, a good builder will help you navigate through that.
Right, because there are options. If the inside of the house basically can work, if the footprint can work, there are solutions for the exterior.
Correct. Yeah.
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 So let's talk about your house in
So my
particular.
house, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, because it was something that you did for your father.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly for my father, and certainly for our family that was growing, right? So at the time that this is a little over 20 years ago now, we had a bungalow with 3 steps to the front door, and we were getting to that point where our 3 kids were getting older and needed, or didn't necessarily need, but would have benefited from having some bigger bedrooms. And I was working at home in our basement. And so everything kind of came to a point where I felt like it was a good time for us to start looking at options again. So I did look at what we could do with our house that we were living in. I looked at moving further into the suburbs, which I didn't like because I don't really like driving that much, and I don't like architectural controls. I hope people are figuring that one out. Um, and moving and moving and primarily I was thinking about my kids going to school, and they were part of a German program, so we knew the high school that they would go to, and getting closer to the high school from where we were would have meant paying way more for the property, and then we'd have to renovate anyway. So everything kind of came back to, why don't we add a second story to this house? So again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that today, but at the time, 20 some years ago, it was barely financially doable. Today, it would be well over $1 million. I just couldn't do it. But at the time, the market was a little bit better. And we live in a neighborhood that just is at the fringe of being an inner city mature neighborhood, and then a block south of us, everything changed, and the development started to be like cul-de-sacs and front car garages and that sort of thing. So our neighborhood is still the older neighborhood with back lanes. Most people have detached garages in the back of their home. But in our case, what happened is we just happened to buy a house that was on what they deemed the show home street. So when this development first was was built in the late 60s, they were flirting with this idea, this concept of having the front car garage. So the house we purchased, because it had 4 bedrooms, not because it had a front car garage, and was affordable for us. We are one of 3 houses that have front car garages on our street, and so our house has got a mixture of various types of dwellings: 2 stories, bungalows, split levels. So it was all this experimentation by the builders at the time, trying to sort of showcase what they think the future would look like for housing. So in our case, instead of our house being 20 feet, our front door being 20 feet away from the street, we're well over 40 feet away from the street. So when we did add the second story to the house, I made sure that we re-poured our driveway and sidewalk so it just gently slopes to the door. And so, just before we show the pictures here, I can just say that um, a typical Saturday for me was to somewhere just after lunchtime, I would hear my kids answer. I'd hear the phone ring, and I'd hear my kids answer, and then go running out the door. And my dad would be parked in his van on our driveway, and he would have treats for his grandkids, and he would give them the treats, and they would run back in the house. And by the time I kind of gathered what was going on, I went out there and my dad was already backing up, or, so we might have a quick conversation, and he'd be gone. And my dad and I were very, very close, and very much enjoyed spending time with him. He very much enjoyed spending time, well, with me, but more more so with my kids. So he really, really loved his grandkids. And I just thought, this is really the epitome of a bad situation, right? Where grandpa can't spend time with his grandkids because of 3 steps at the front door. And so that became a vital part of what I did with the house. And so, the first time that he was able to visit without the steps at the door, he just wheeled up to the door and rang the doorbell and came in, and had time to sit and have coffee with us and watch the kids play with the toys he bought them and the treats he got them and all that. So it really was huge in terms of the whole emotional side of things, right? Not just the physical part of making it accessible for him, but just how much closer it brought him to be with his own grandkids.
That completely changed the dynamic.
Completely. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it seems so basic, right? But it's not. It's just something you see all the time. And somehow grandparents, just, I think they kind of make it, they'll make it work for them. But I've witnessed what it can be like, right? And so that's why I promote what I do, because I think, well, every grandparent, now that I'm a grandparent myself, um, every grandparent should have that joy of spending as much time as possible with their grandkids. I don't think there's anything better in life than that.
Absolutely. Well, we have some pictures that we can show of your house, and you can describe them. Now, we'll do our best to describe them for those who are listening to this as a podcast. Those of you who are watching this as a video presentation will see them, but we'll put the slides onto our website with the show notes so that those who have heard it can then go and see it. Okay, we look at the
Sure.
first one.
Yeah. So just by way of explaining too, this is my house, looking from the driveway, looking up the sloping sidewalk to the front door. The gentleman who's wheeling, he's just at the bottom of the sidewalk where the sort of the driveway transitions to the sidewalk. This is a friend of mine who used a wheelchair, and he was my model for the day. See, it's a little bit of winter conditions. You can see the side of his van. So this would have been very typical of what my dad would have done as well. And so this gentleman now can just so any of my clients, any of my own friends and family who use wheelchairs, baby carriages, and the other thing that we haven't mentioned, moving furniture, moving
Oh,
a washer, dryer, a fridge. Like, everybody loves this house for for those sorts of things. So this gentleman is just starting to make his way up the sidewalk. It's not a ramp; it's just a sidewalk that has a very gentle slope. So we can go to the next slide, which shows him getting closer to the entranceway. Again, he uses a, a, a manual wheelchair, so he propels himself up the slope, and he's able to do that. Now, having said that, not everybody who uses a manual chair uh, uh, could necessarily negotiate this slope. It is very gentle, but it's not flat. So people that maybe have a little less arm power might need some help up the slope. But then you can see at the door there are no steps at the front door.
that's actually a really good point because I have talked to people who have been in wheelchairs who are unable to navigate the slopes that are determined by code.
Yes,
So
yeah,
even code is beyond their ability to manage it independently.
yeah. And
So,
just for information for the listeners, the code is the bare minimum, and it is primarily based. The code is primarily designed for those people who use manual wheelchairs, and I'm going to say somebody like Rick Hansen. So
mm-hmm.
a strong uh, um, uh, person who uses a manual wheelchair. That's how the code. That's what's reflected in our national building code. So if you have less arm strength,
Or
or you
core,
use a large or core, or you use a larger power wheelchair, there's a lot in the code that just wouldn't accommodate you.
right? Okay. So we move to the next one.
Yeah, yeah. And then this just shows the gentleman. He's moved to the side. He's approached the door at the side. There's a lever door handle, which again is in the sustainability world. We often talk about the light bulb, the energy efficient light bulb, being that sort of easy thing that we can all do. The lever door handle is that as well. The lever door handle is something we can all easily do and afford to do, and it just makes life so much easier for anybody with limited hand mobility. If you're carrying bags and you just use your elbow to open it up. Um, we have the door in our back leads out onto a patio that my son's dog has learned to from the outside open the door, push it open, and then she's even smart enough to shut the door, right? So it's always great to see her do that. uh, so it's sort of that benefit for everybody. And so yeah, this image is just showing him getting to the door. So I think as we're showing these pictures too, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but something I think can be quite powerful, and the technology is there uh, uh, affordably, and everything else is creating little videos. So one of the things, just going back to the Halloween concept, is I'd love to have like a little video of this scenario where a child is making his or her way up to the door and getting treats from the homeowners in this no step entrance. I think it could be a great video to promote this concept of the no step entrance.
Right.
And then we'll just show the last slide. So this last slide just shows the gentleman in the wheelchair, shows his wheels, his front wheels and his feet approaching the door threshold. And certainly one of the things that in my time being around people who use wheelchairs, a lot of wheelchairs now, compared to what my dad used, have much smaller front wheels. And so my dad's front wheels were quite quite big, actually. So getting over even a minor bump wasn't too hard. But these smaller wheelchairs and people who use walkers, for example, with the small wheels, even a minor bump can be quite challenging for people. So so in this case, what we need to really think through with the actual door threshold is that we minimize any kind of bump at all.
What is that? About a
So
quarter of an inch? It's not even a
it
half
it,
inch, is
it, it
it?
it's a quarter of an inch,
Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it's at the door threshold. So what we did in our case, so again, there when you think this through, you can come up with different ideas. But in our case, we poured the foundation with a notch in the where the door would be. So we actually sunk the door into the foundation, and then we could pour the concrete right up to the threshold, and then the interior flooring was right up to the door threshold. And so that little quarter of an inch bump is there just to manage the water. So as this is something I've learned through trial and error, is if there is no bump, like even a quarter an inch, what can like a completely flat threshold, like a commercial kind of threshold, the water can collect on your door, and just come down the door, and once it hits the threshold, it either is going to go towards the inside of the house or the outside. So that little quarter inch bump allows the water then to make sure that it ends up going to the outside.
And you've
So
also covered the
and then
walkway,
we've covered the walkway as well. Yeah.
and I'm
So we
sure there's
tried
really
to.
good weather stripping.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And again, that's the one part. The one thing that I can say too that was a huge advantage for us with our house is at the entrance, we did have to use not special, we had to use a different technique of waterproofing and so on. So we poured the foundation to the top of the floor level, and then we actually have our floor joists inside the concrete foundation wall. So typically in construction, we build our foundation wall in concrete, and then we put our floor joists on top of that, which are wood. So that's why we end up around 2 feet above the ground. Is our floor joist is usually at least 12 inches or 16 inches, and then we have to be another 8 inches below the bottom of the floor, the wood part of the floor. So that's typically why you'll see at least a couple of steps to a front door, is because the land is lower than the main floor level. And so in our house, we didn't have to modify or change anything. So we're everywhere else in the house, we're 2 feet above the ground level, but just at the door, as that concrete slopes up, we just have a waterproof membrane that separates any of the floor from the exterior. So it's just very simple, very inexpensive, but not commonly done, and therefore you have to make sure people you communicate that to people. So again, uh, if the buying public thinks that builders know all this stuff, then they're in for a surprise. And so the more they know, the better, right? Because when the builder, I've actually had people come to me and say, well, my builder told me the code doesn't allow me to have a no step entrance. And I
Right.
just say, well, that's completely false. So either the builder innocently doesn't know that, or just doesn't want to bother learning or doing it, right? Either
Right.
way, the person usually doesn't approach me until after the work was done. So by then it's too late. So again, it's important to inform as many people as possible that this is pretty simple stuff, but we just have to know that it's there.
Right. But to be clear to people who may be listening and thinking, oh, well, I could do this. You could do it, as you said, because you had a nice long front yard, a deep front yard.
Yeah,
People who don't have a deep front yard, which is normally the case in
in
more
infill.
current subdivisions,
Yeah.
right? And
Yes.
infill
Yeah.
housing, right?
Yeah.
This would not be an option for them, but definitely explore it if you are in a neighborhood that has provided you with a nice deep front yard. Or maybe I have seen subdivisions that have terrific front yards and hardly any backyard, so you never know.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you have
Yeah.
sufficient room, this could be an option for you. If you don't
Yeah.
have sufficient
Yeah.
room, we have to look at the ramps and the lifts.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And one thing that I often that helps, I think helps people when they first contact me and they say, well, we're thinking of trying to find a home that we could modify. Do you have any recommendations? I always say the first thing you can do is when you drive up to that house, what is the distance from the main floor to the ground? So essentially, how many steps are at the front door? And that right away, that'll tell you if there's 2 steps, that's better. If there's 5 or 6 steps, you're probably looking at some sort of addition to the house that will have maybe a ramp or a porch lift, but often like an addition. Or but anyway, no matter how you slice it, it's going to be more expensive and harder to do. So you
Right.
always first want to just drive by houses and go, wow, that house for sale is really low to the ground. That might be a good option. And then once you're inside, you have to look at, okay, when I'm inside, are there steps anywhere leading up to the level? Like, can I enter and then have to go up a few steps, or am I right at that main floor level? And then, of course, the bathroom is always going to be the trickiest part of the reno. But
Right.
you can save yourself a lot of time by just driving around and finding a house that already looks like it's worth going inside and checking it out.
Right. Now, there are housing developments that are being built with government support that are looking at issues like adaptability and accessibility. And I'm thinking of the one in Winnipeg called Bridgewater. Can you tell us about that development?
Yeah, yeah. I did manage to learn quite a bit about Bridgewater myself, when I was working on a task force on visitability. And just to back up, um, um, a little bit, our inspiration actually, or the inspiration for Bridgewater, came from a Chicago neighborhood just outside of Chicago called Bolingbrook. And Bolingbrook has an interesting history in that they tried to create regulations for visitable housing. So like actual government imposed rules that said you have to make your homes visitable. And they got a lot of pushback from the industry, of course. That's to be expected. But in the end, the industry itself went, this is actually a pretty good idea. Let's do it. And so I've never been to Bolingbrook myself, but I've talked to others that have been there, and what I know about it is that a huge number, like maybe even 75 to 80% of the homes are being built to be visitable. And it started as a government kind of forced issue, legislated issue that morphed into something that the market kind of accepted and bought into and enjoy and benefit from. So that was one of the things that really helped the people that orchestrated Bridgewater in Winnipeg to do what they did. And it's a provincially funded and initiated um, development. It's supposed to house roughly 30,000 residents in single family and multifamily homes, and visitability was on the table right from the beginning. So they basically outlined areas within the development that amounts to about 25% of the homes, the single family homes, to be visitable. So the actual land has been designed with the proper infrastructure, sewer lines, water lines, that sort of thing, and the landscaping with water management and so on, to lend themselves very nicely to the builder just buying the lot and building the house on what's there. So they don't have to do extra work to sculpt the land, or think about sewer sump pumps in the house or anything like that. They could just build like they normally do, um, and just not have steps at the front door. And in speaking with some of the builders that did it, they went, yeah, we kind of resisted at first because we didn't know what we were getting ourselves into. But once we built, um, uh, one and then more, this was really easy, and it just makes really good sense. But everything was done in the beginning to make it easy for the builder later on. So again, that gets back to um, the government instigating this and starting it, right? That's what we really need, I think. Um, Whether it's financially or however they make it, financially, I guess, is ultimately what you'd like to see. But it's got to be, there's got to be the political will first, and then everything else will, kind of follow, I think, right? And so Bridgewater is the only example that I'm aware of in Canada that really it has pushed it to this new level.
It's really interesting that in the beginning there was pushback from the professionals involved in this, all the builders, the designers, and whatnot. And then as they got accustomed to it, they thought, this is pretty good. And they actually are interested in doing this again.
Yes,
Now
yeah,
they have this
that's right.
whole other mindset and skill set about how to make this happen.
Yeah.
So Bridgewater is something that is in the process of being built, or how built out is it at this
I
point?
it's actually quite built up. I'm not sure if it's
Okay.
completely finished, but I think it is actually. I think it is completely finished. Yeah. So
Okay.
it's from what I heard, again, it perfectly in line with what you're talking about with the pushback. I think very few visitable homes were built in the first go round, and then the government went, well, this is dumb. Like, we got to push this harder. So then they got further involved, and then the next go round they got up to that 25%. And yeah, that's sort of, if you build it they will come kind of thing, I guess. But um it's a little bit unfortunate that it hasn't caught on more and sort of spread across the country. Here in Edmonton, we have our old downtown airport is a perfect piece of land to do visitable housing, and I haven't actually had a lot of success myself and others that are pushing for this with our current, or sorry, I shouldn't say current city council, the older city council. We have a new council with some, I think, some really innovative and forward thinking young people that I think will truly revisit this whole issue. And we also have our old, what we call our expo site, where the Edmonton Oilers used to play hockey. And that whole area is set for redevelopment. So we have a lot of tremendous opportunities just here in Edmonton to do some really great things. And again, we really really need the political will. And I have to say that I was pleasantly surprised and to see the current council when the elections happened, and some of the people that are council members now. And I think we also have a very progressive and forward-thinking mayor as well. So um, there's good opportunities here for all of this.
Right. And there could be right across the country and indeed around the world if they started looking at this sort of housing as a benefit to everyone for so many reasons, right?
Yeah, yeah. And really, and tying everything in with this concept of sustainability, because I think we all have well, I shouldn't say we all, but most of us have a pretty good understanding of sustainability and energy efficiency, and how we can build um, to create more affordable housing that is also energy efficient and ultimately we benefit as individual homeowners, but society benefits overall. And we really have to talk about accessibility in the same way. It's really just a part of our whole sustainability issue in our talk. And unfortunately, most people that I know who push for a more sustainable type of design don't always appreciate or understand what the role of accessibility is in all of this. Whereas those of us in the accessibility world completely understand that this is part of a bigger issue, which is having a more sustainable way of developing our land.
And living our lives.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. Any last thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I'm just.
We've talked about a
I'm,
lot.
I'm hoping. Yeah, I'm hoping a lot of people are tuning in and taking notes. And I'm certainly. I have to say I am much busier these days. So I used to pride myself on getting back to everybody that reached out to me. That is frankly getting a little harder. A lot of times people will email me or phone me, and I just direct them to my website, at least so that they can get a sense of my website is really not promoting my architectural abilities. It's more the accessibility side of things. So people can learn a lot about accessibility from the website, and they can involve me in projects if they want. But more importantly, I think they just need to inform themselves, right, and educate themselves, and then start spreading that out there. So it's it's sort of like the throwing that pebble in the pond and hoping it has that ripple effect. So like I said, I've been around this a long time, and I know that my dad had a huge impact on what we see here in Edmonton. But I have to say that there, for quite a long time, there was a real lull in things where the issues weren't being discussed as much, and it's just, I think we've hit a critical mass of our senior population that's really getting and the pandemic obviously didn't help in any way, but certainly exposed the issues. So people are starting to talk about it more and see that there should be a better way to create housing and live with a stronger community spirit, and live longer in the house that you buy when you're a young couple, let's say.
Right. In the community that you've come to love and you know where everything
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. All of that,
Terrific.
yeah.
Well, we'll put your website with the show notes along with the pictures, and I'm going to try to find a link for Bolingbrook in Chicago. I know that there
Okay,
is one for Bridgewater in Winnipeg, so I'll put all of that information with the show notes so that people can take a look.
great.
Thank you very much for
Excellent.
joining us again.
Hey, well, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And I would invite any of our listeners to come back for future editions of the Real Life Renos podcast. Real Life Renos, the podcast, is a production of Reno Studios, executive produced by Karen Brown. This is Real Life theme, music, and lyrics by Jane Carmichael, recorded at Swamp Songs Recording Studio in Lucan, Ontario, engineered by Matt Weston. Thank you for tuning in.